Okay, so good morning everybody. Welcome to UK Theatre and Society of London Theatre's webinar this morning on apprenticeships. I can see you all coming in, so hopefully you can hear me. If you can kind of give me a thumbs up in the chat that you can hear me, that you can see Sarah and I, that would be great. Let's see you just coming in. So great. Thank you, Claudia. Fabulous. So, yep, so we'll just wait. We've got to see numbers are just climbing up at the moment. So welcome to people who are just joining to this morning's webinar. Thank you, Sarah. On apprenticeships. I'm joined with here today by Sara Whybrew from Creative and Cultural Skills, CC Skills. While you're coming in, can I ask you in the chat to put in your name and your organisation? Because it's a webinar, we can't see you, we can't hear you, but it would be great to see who's with us in the chat function. What we're going to do today is, like I say, the webinar is being recorded. Sarah's here, that's great. So yeah, everybody pop your name and organisation in the chat. We've still got numbers climbing up, so we will give it a minute or so until we start. Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Yep, just put your name and organisation in the chat. Okay, fantastic. Right. Good morning, everybody. Fantastic. So we've got everybody coming in. Fabulous. Okay, so if you just joined us, please pop your name and organisation in the chat function, and we're going to start. So as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available on Theatre Means Business for up to 6 months. But of course, some of the content, if the content changes in here, if anything changes in terms of apprenticeships, then again, it's the kind of thing that we will take down to make sure that it is up to date. So as a reminder, if you need to raise, if you've got a question, please pop it in the chat, and if you can, in terms of making it easier for us, if it's a question, please put in bold question and then followed by your question. We're joined on here today also by Sebastian and Annie from UK Theatre and Society of London, who are going to help us with some of the tech, etc. We're going to make the session interactive as we can, considering it's a webinar. So Sarah is going to go through everything, and at any point, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat. We will have time for questions at the end, but there are certain parts of the webinar which need your interaction. So please get ready to type and respond. So as an introduction from us, before I hand over to Sarah, as you know, UK Theatre and Society of London Theatre have workforce as one of their priorities. And in that, we are concerned about keeping the pipeline of talent open and diverse, but also maintaining talent within the sector as well. We see apprenticeships as one of those kind of vessels, I suppose, of doing that. And we know many of you use apprenticeships in the sector really successfully already, whether that's a marketing apprenticeship to a chef apprenticeship to a technician. And today, the purpose of the session is for many of you who don't use apprenticeships to understand more about how they work, possibly how you might take on an apprentice. And I think also it's probably good for context, as you know, is that there is a consultation that shut yesterday around how we can make apprenticeships more flexible. And that means for the theatre sector, so for those of us who have odd working patterns potentially, so shorter project-based, etc. So Sarah might talk about that at the end. That is not the purpose of today's. This is about apprenticeships and how they work now. So Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you, and you'll do a bit of an intro, and we'll go from there. All right.
Thank you. Thanks, Hannah. And thanks to UK Theatre for having me today. I'm Sara Whybrew. I'm the Director of Policy and Development at Creative and Cultural Skills. I'm going to share my screen, so please excuse the momentary tech change. I'm hoping everyone can see my screen. Hannah, can you just confirm? I'll just go into proper presenter view. Can someone just confirm?
We can see you, Sarah.
That's great.
All good.
Thanks ever so much. So I should explain that this session, it takes about 90 minutes, which includes time for your questions. It is a nuts and bolts session about apprenticeships. It covers the basics and is therefore for those who may not have much prior experience or knowledge about apprenticeships. We do have other sessions about apprenticeships that are longer and take a much deeper dive and are designed to support those who may be new to managing apprentices, which I can talk about at the end. But this one is very much nuts and bolts. For those who aren't familiar with creative and cultural skills, and I mean, no doubt some of you have never heard of us before, we are a UK-wide charity and the Sector Skills Council for the cultural industries. And we're here to work towards creating a fair and skilled cultural sector. And we do this by trying to shape skills, education, and employment best practice. We are the body that introduced apprenticeships to the cultural industries many years ago, and we continue to work very closely on the creation and rollout of apprenticeships across all 4 nations of the UK. I'm aware today that I have some people on this call from Scotland and Wales as well as England, so I am going to cover some of the facts that are specific to each nation related to apprenticeships. Skills and apprenticeships is a devolved matter, and that means each nation has its own system to get to grips with. Apprenticeships are also a really important tool, as Hannah has touched on, to help us open up alternative entry routes into our sector, particularly for those who are perhaps underrepresented in our workforce. And there's really good evidence to show that apprenticeships can support those who are typically overlooked for employment in our sector to progress and have really strong careers. But let's think about why apprenticeships are really important beyond that. We have a number of skills issues in our sector, which I'm not sure is news to anyone. And actually, apprenticeships are ideally placed to help us address the skills issues that we have. And there's really strong evidence to show that. By addressing skills issues, we can improve business growth and productivity. But apprenticeships, amongst other work-based entry routes, mean that we're giving individuals a choice about how they can potentially learn and progress into our sector. And that in turn means that we can reach out to a broader and more diverse pool of talent. There's no such thing as a one-size route fits all, and we want the sector to embrace offering choice. Apprenticeships, if we use them, also helps us place value on technical training routes, just as we do academic options. We are a sector that employs more graduates than any other part of the UK economy by almost twice as many. So if we think about that, also in relation to the diversity of our sector, we know that higher education academic routes typically don't have a highly representative sort of population going through those academic routes. Actually, we need to also place value on technical training routes if we do want to diversify. And also apprenticeships are one way, they're not the only way, but they are one way to help us tackle some of our unhelpful and historic recruitment cultures in our sector. We still see and we still have employers making use of unpaid workers. That's not the same as taking on a genuine volunteer. We have a different session about what constitutes unpaid work and different definitions for different routes in, which I'm not going to cover today, but apprenticeships can help us formalise some of the ways we help people make the step into and through our sector. in place of some very unhelpful and in some cases unlawful routes in. So this is where I'm going to ask you to put your thoughts into the chat box. I'm going to start with a really basic question. What is an apprenticeship to you? When you think of an apprenticeship, what do you think of? And Hannah, I'm going to ask you to monitor the chat function and shout out what comes in, because I
No
won't
worries.
see it.
Somebody says it's a trainee.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I would say that it's a job.
Yeah, great.
Somebody says it's about young people gaining skills.
Okay, great.
Somebody else says hands-on practical training. Another says opportunity for in-job training to develop skills.
Okay.
Somebody else says it's a structured and paid training program.
Yeah.
Another person says worker gaining skills and experience.
Yeah.
An employee of a company to learn and gain experience in the job/industry.
Very nice.
Somebody else says shadowing others to learn new skills in order to progress into a career.
Okay.
So,
that's really helpful. Some really great responses there, all of which, most of which are positioned within it being a training route. It is, and someone has mentioned shadowing. There is no shadowing involved in an apprenticeship. What an apprentice is, first and foremost, by law, is an employee. And the definition of an employee in UK employment law now includes reference to an apprentice. What an apprenticeship is, always, first and foremost, is a real job that someone is learning how to do that leads either to the achievement of a qualification or, in England, the certification of occupational competence. So what we really want employers to take away is that an apprenticeship is always, first and foremost, a job, a real job. It's not an add-on, it's a real job that employers need someone to learn how to do, and an apprentice is always an employee. But there are core elements to every apprenticeship, and this applies in all 4 nations of the UK. There is, oh, sorry, I've gone too far. On the job learning, that makes up 80% of the apprenticeship. The on the job learning really describes the job that you, the employer, is giving the apprentice to learn how to do whilst they're with you. So that makes up the bulk of the apprenticeship. Then there's off the job learning, which makes up, roughly speaking, 20% of the apprenticeship. The off the job learning is undertaken with a registered training provider, and that off the job learning can be undertaken through different delivery models. Sometimes it can be done through part virtual learning, through masterclasses, through day release, through block release, which is where the learning is put together over a chunk of time, or it can even be front loaded, so it can be undertaken in full at the start of an apprenticeship, so the apprentice then spends the rest of their time with you, the employer, actually applying what they've learned off the job, on the job, whilst learning how to do the job with you. For those apprentices who don't already hold what we call a functional skills, essential skills, or core skills qualification, and I'll explain what these mean, then every apprentice in every nation of the UK has to achieve the relevant functional skills before they can complete their apprenticeship. In England, functional skills, England and Northern Ireland, functional skills really refer to English and maths. So if someone doesn't hold a GCSE in those subjects, typically this is the easiest way to think about it, then they need to gain a qualification in those subjects before they can complete their apprenticeship. There are some exceptions to that rule, where a learner may have a declared learning disability and is therefore unlikely to successfully complete the functional skills at the required level of difficulty. but they would still need to be able to fulfil the on-the-job and off-the-job learning requirements for the apprenticeship. In Wales, this section of an apprenticeship where a learner needs to undertake it is called essential skills, and it covers application of number, which is just a fancy name for maths, communication, a slightly different term for English, and digital literacy, or sometimes called ITC. And in Scotland, this section is called core skills. It's a bit different in Scotland. Core skills actually covers a bit more: communication, numeracy, information and communication technology, problem solving, and working with others. But I should stress, in most cases in Scotland, core skills are embedded within the apprenticeship qualification itself, and I'm going to explain the difference between the two shortly. In England, apprenticeships are guided by an apprenticeship standard. So the apprenticeship standard describes, in effect, the occupation that the apprentice is training to reach competence in. The standard is articulated through core duties that apprentice would typically be expected to fulfill. And those duties are underpinned by knowledge, skills, and behaviours. Knowledge describes what someone needs to know to fulfill the requirements of that occupation. Skills describe what someone needs to be able to do to fulfill the requirements of that occupation. And behaviours describe how that individual, that apprentice, would be expected to go about fulfilling the requirements of the occupation. All apprenticeship standards are written by, or ultimately the content is determined by, employers and occupational specialists, referred to as a trailblazer group. A trailblazer group is simply a group of employers and occupational specialists who have come together to help determine the content for an apprenticeship standard. The apprenticeship standard also defines what the apprentice is going to be assessed against at the end of their apprenticeship to demonstrate whether they have achieved competence in the defined occupation. This applies England only. In Scotland,
Can I just but in a sec, can you give some examples of the standards we're using in theatre at the moment, so it's to make it kind of a bit more real? I find it helpful.
So there are a lot. I should say, not just specifically for theatre, but overall, there are in excess now of 500 apprenticeship standards, so over 500 occupations that can be trained for via an apprenticeship route, which span business administration, which is actually frequently used in theatre, right through to training to be a solicitor, also used in theatre. We have some very specific apprenticeship standards for theatre. So we have creative venue technician, which is currently being merged with the live events technician standard. We have cultural learning and participation officer for those who wish to train to work in the education and outreach departments of theatres, and also that's used in museums and galleries, etc. We're also it's not live yet, but we also have you're not museums. We also have costume performance technician, so those who repair costumes and dress actors. We are also in the process of making available scenic artists, scenic construction and scenic automation technician, as well as hair, makeups, wigs and prosthetics technician. There is also a production manager standard and many others. And also we see a number of theatres using the customer service apprenticeship to train people who work on front of house. So in the nations,
Sarah, we don't. Sorry, just a quick question from someone asking where that list can be found.
I can send a link out if that's helpful.
Popped it in the chat.
Great.
One over here. There you go.
Brilliant. There is, yeah, if you just go to the Institute for Apprenticeships website for anyone, Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education website, and you just click on Apprenticeship Standards and you filter in the left bar to Creative and Design, you'll see all of the standards that have been put under the Creative and Design route, which includes all of the ones specifically created for theatre. But as I said, it's also worth bearing in mind that we use a number of what we call generic standards across the theatre and performing arts sector as well, like business administration, like customer service, including some of the hospitality ones, and some of the legal, the paralegal and solicitor. In the nations, we don't have apprenticeship standards, we have apprenticeship frameworks. These actually are qualifications. So apprenticeship standards aren't qualifications, they're like a glorified job description. In the nations, frameworks underpin apprenticeship training, and they are underpinned and defined by dedicated qualifications that have been written against what we call national occupational standards. National occupational standards are informed by employers, but it's a slightly more removed process than it is in England. There are two qualifications that typically make up an apprenticeship framework: a competency-based qualification, that's the skills bit, and a knowledge-based qualification, the stuff that someone needs to know. They are either two standalone qualifications within a framework, or they are combined into one qualification where the knowledge is embedded within the competency. In this case, the apprentice is continuously assessed throughout their apprenticeship by the training provider with whom they undertake the off-the-job training, that 20%. The successful completion of the underpinning qualifications leads to the apprentice being certificated against the apprenticeship framework. So some of that's quite a lot of detail, but you just need to remember, in England, an apprentice is working towards an apprenticeship standard, which is like a glorified job description, and they are working towards being assessed at the end of their apprenticeship. In Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, they are working against an apprenticeship framework, which is guided by dedicated qualifications that are assessed constantly throughout the apprenticeship. This is who's involved in delivering an apprenticeship. You cannot offer and deliver a formal apprenticeship without all parties being involved. So there's you guys, the employer, you're the ones responsible for providing employment for the duration of the apprenticeship. The duration of an apprenticeship varies. I'm going to come on to that in a moment. So you're looking after the on-the-job training. The training provider who delivers the off-the-job training, they must be registered to deliver the specific apprenticeship that you have your apprentice working towards. So you can't just pick any training provider, they have to be registered to deliver the specific apprenticeship you wish to offer. In England, there is then a separately registered endpoint assessment organisation for the specific apprenticeship who independently assesses the apprentice as competent at the end or not. They must be independent of you, the employer, and the training provider. And in most cases, they are an awarding body. If that means anything to anyone, awarding bodies are the organisations that typically write qualifications. In the nations, there is no endpoint assessment, as I've mentioned, because there's continuous assessment, but the awarding body who issues the underpinning qualifications is responsible for verifying the training provider's assessment and then awards the underpinning qualifications. And in all nations, once the apprentice has been deemed to have reached competence and or achieved their underpinning qualifications, then the separate certification body issues the certificate of achievement. In England, there is only one certification body, that is the Education and Skills Funding Agency. In the nations, it is the awarding body who is either the awarding body or a separate certificating body. In Scotland, Northern Ireland, sorry, it doesn't apply in Northern Ireland. In Scotland and Wales, we are the certificating body for the creative apprenticeship frameworks. So the technical theatre framework that exists in the nations, we actually certificate learners as having achieved their apprenticeship. So I'm going to momentarily pause there and just ask if anyone has any questions or if there's anything that I've said so far that isn't clear or doesn't make sense.
Sarah, can I just check, will you be sharing the slides at the end or will we just give links? What would be most helpful?
I can share the slides, but we share them as a PDF, so that's absolutely fine. That's no problem at all. And I should also say we are here for anyone to ask questions at any time. That's part of what we're here for, so people can contact Creative and Cultural Skills, and I'll share some details at the end. If you've got any question at all, it doesn't matter how big or small it is. We also provide one-to-one support to employers to help guide them through the creation of apprenticeships or other work-based entry routes they wish to use. And there's no charge for that. That's part of what we do as a sector support organisation. So people are free to use us as much or as little as they wish to. So,
Sarah,
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go for it. Any questions? Yeah.
Yep, got a question in. So are there standard pay grades for apprenticeships that organisations should use?
There is, I'm going to come on to pay actually, but I'll answer the question. There aren't standard pay grades for apprenticeships. There is a minimum wage rate that specifically applies to apprentices, but there are conditions that surround that, which I'll clarify in a moment. But there is nothing to stop an employer creating a dedicated pay grade if you have pay bands in your organisation for apprenticeships, as long as that pay band does not dip below, obviously, the minimum national minimum wage rate that would be applicable.
Okay, thank you. There's
talk about.
One more here, which you may come to, I don't know. If there isn't a listed apprenticeship appropriate to the area, so I'm assuming a standard, in which you want to offer one, can this be done and what's the process?
Just to clarify, is the question about if there isn't an apprenticeship
if there isn't one listed
available for the occupation? Okay, so yes, new apprenticeship. Is this, can I just check, is this a question from an employer in England or in one of the nations? Because the answer varies.
It's from England.
Okay, so in England, yeah, anyone can develop new apprenticeship standards, and we can help facilitate that. Again, there's no charge for that. But there would need to be clear evidence of demand that the sector needed to train people in the specific occupation, and there would need to be a group of employers that all shared the view and need for developing a new apprenticeship standard. So one single employer couldn't do that, but if there was a group of employers, then yes, you can go ahead and do that. The process isn't overly straightforward. That's why we help facilitate it. It is a formal government process. So once you've got your Trailblazer group, that group of employers together, you have to submit a proposal to develop the new apprenticeship standard. If that gets approved by the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, you can then move on to developing the standard itself, that glorified job description, and then what's called the assessment plan, and that articulates how the endpoint assessment organisation would be expected to assess the methods that they would use to assess the apprentice against the standard. All in, it can take between about 12 months to 18 months. We have had some go on for longer to develop a new apprenticeship standard. Occasionally they can be developed quicker than that, but it's rare. We haven't known many. And what we do in this instance is we do the physical writing for the employers, because the content needs to be written in a certain way that speaks to both employers and the education system. No one's obligated to have us facilitate it, by the way, but we offer that to help make the process less onerous for employers. What I will say is that I haven't yet been unable to match a job role to an existing apprenticeship standard. what we call a job or a title we give a job isn't necessarily the same as the specific duties and responsibilities that sit in that might be might sit under a different bracket in the world of apprenticeship standards. So one of the services we offer to employers is to match the job description they've written for an apprenticeship to the most appropriate apprenticeship standard. And that sometimes means we find a standard that may have a completely different title, but the core and content of that standard directly aligns to the role the employer has available. And as yet, as I said, I don't think I failed to match one, or anyone in the team has failed to match one, but that doesn't mean there aren't occupations that don't have a standard.
Sarah, I've been asked this before about producers.
Yeah.
And whether, because as you know, in the industry, we've got stage one, which is a separate piece where we bring in producers into the industry.
Yeah.
And one of the questions was whether something that would be turned in, or could be parts of it could be turned in an apprenticeship or not. And I don't know whether that already has one that's matching, or again, it might be something to be developed.
Yeah, potentially it could be. There is also the option now of developing what's called higher technical qualifications, where existing training programs can be taken and badged as an HTQ. It depends on the level of difficulty, and I'd be happy, Hannah, to have a look at that and then to give my specific thoughts about how it could be moved in to a technical space. I will say that I worked with a group of festivals a couple of years ago who wanted a standard for a producer, and actually there is a standard called assistant project manager, and when I presented that to the group, every single one of them said, this is exactly what we do. And there was nothing in that standard that didn't fulfill what a producer does, and that's a really good example actually of where the title of a job and the core of a job may sound different, but actually the purpose is ultimately the same. So all the skills, sorry, ultimately the same, but you purpose it differently. So we can look at that.
Yeah, we've just had in the chat, Emily said that she'd be really interested to talk more about the producing conversations, shared her email with us, so we can do. Yeah,
I'd happily, more than happy to pick that up.
All right.
And actually, when I worked with the group of festivals, I received about 20 job descriptions, all describing the role that they do, and that's what I used to match it to, and that's when the producer said, actually, this is exactly what we do. So it's about knowing how to use the most appropriate standard. But yeah, if there's a gap, then we can potentially help fill it. That's no problem.
Thank you. No more questions for now.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is where I'm going to ask you to interact. There's a couple of slides here, I'm afraid. I heard earlier some reference when I asked what you describe an apprenticeship as, some reference to who you thought apprenticeships were for actually within some of those answers, and it would be really great for everyone to just, or for some, to just pop in the chat who you think apprenticeships are for.
Great. Okay, I will wait for things to come in. So yeah, just pop in the chat. So somebody says 16 to 24-year-olds.
Okay.
Up to 24.
Okay.
16 or older, any age.
Yeah.
That probably covers all of the options.
Okay, nice. Okay, so it's a myth that apprenticeships are just for young people. They're a great way to support young people and the next generation into the workforce. There's no denying that. But actually, apprenticeships are for anyone aged 16 or over who have completed their final GCSE year at school. There is an exception there in Scotland, which I'll clarify in a moment. But the truth is, Every single one of us on this call could be an apprentice if we wanted to be. If we were training for a new career, we could use an apprenticeship to career change. Apprenticeships are for new entrants, existing staff who wish to upskill to progress into a new role, or for those who wish to change career. They are technically for anyone. But what they can't do is support someone who is already obviously competent in an occupation. They wouldn't need to. So if you're already doing a job and you're already doing it autonomously, you can't then do an apprenticeship to somehow retrofit the achievement of a certificate or a qualification. They are designed to help someone reach competence in a new occupation. So if I wanted to train to be a solicitor now, I could technically choose to train to be a solicitor via an apprenticeship if I wanted to change career. Prerequisites for entry should be kept to a minimum. There is a myth here that people who do apprenticeships must hold prior qualifications in the related occupational field of study. That is actually not the case, and it would make someone in some cases ineligible for an apprenticeship. The apprenticeship itself has to train someone to reach competence, and I'm labouring the point now, to reach competence in the occupation. So they are designed to help someone get there. And actually, there's lots of talk about someone, and I'm going to come on to educational levels in a moment, but some may have heard reference to doing a level 2 apprenticeship, then a level 3 apprenticeship, then a level 4 apprenticeship. In England, that's described as a ladder of learning. In England, that doesn't apply to apprenticeships anymore. That rule has gone. So you can technically, give or take, train for any occupation for which there is an apprenticeship route straight from school or straight from a different job. It doesn't matter. In the nations, that rule is slightly different, where ladders of learning may apply because apprenticeships are guided by qualifications. So you may, in some instances, have to do a lower level to then progress on to the higher level for the occupation you're training for. But prerequisites for entry into an apprenticeship should always be kept to a minimum. They aren't training people who already know how to do a job. They're training someone who needs to learn how to do a job.
Sarah, I have a quick question. What about if somebody is older and doesn't have GCSEs? Is there like an equivalent? Is it, like you say, just an English and maths at some
so
point?
if you need to do if you're referring to the functional skills element of the apprenticeship, the English and maths, or essential skills or core skills in Wales and Scotland respectively, yes, there are separate qualifications that are called functional skills qualifications that cover the subjects that you need to achieve in order to then be able to go on and achieve your apprenticeship. You don't have to resit a GCSE per se. If you've already got a GCSE in the relevant functional skill, then you don't need to do it at all. You've already achieved it. You don't need to do the functional skill at all. In fact, the GCSE would be bigger in sort of learning volume than a functional skill would be. If someone does hold prior qualifications in a subject, that's fine. You can still do an apprenticeship and get your training funded to do the apprenticeship. I'm going to talk about how that works in a moment. As long as your prior qualifications are in a completely different subject to the apprenticeship. So if I'm, for example, I'm a trained teacher, I couldn't do an apprenticeship to train to become a teacher because I'm already qualified. But if I chose to do training in a completely different field, using the solicitor example I shared a moment ago, my prior qualifications would be irrelevant because it's a completely different subject. So I'd be eligible to train for a new occupation via an apprenticeship and get the training element, the off-the-job training, funded. And I'll talk about how funding works in a moment. In Scotland, the only differences to what I've just laid out, because I appreciate we have got an employer from Scotland on the call, school leaving age varies. So Everywhere else, it's 16 or over where you've completed your final GCSE year at school. In Scotland, depending on when your birthday falls, you can actually leave school at 15. And there is something called a foundation apprenticeship in Scotland that can be undertaken from the age of 14, but it's not work-based in quite the same way as all the other apprenticeship options are. And the category, and I'm going to clarify this in a moment, of apprenticeship in Scotland that's referred to as a modern apprenticeship. There are different types of apprenticeships in Scotland, but a modern apprenticeship is specifically geared towards 16 to 24-year-olds, and then there are other apprenticeship types of apprenticeship that can support any age. There are exceptions to that 16 to 24-year rule for modern apprenticeships, but it's typically geared towards that demographic. And in Scotland, graduate apprenticeships, there is no upper age limit, so it's just the modern apprenticeship that has an age bracket. So again, Hannah, I'm going to ask you to monitor the chat. I'm going to ask some really basic questions. These, I'm in no doubt you guys will know the answer to these questions, but I ask them because these are the questions we get most commonly in relation to apprenticeships. So, does an apprentice need to be paid? Quickly pop your answers in the chat.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Good, yes, perfect yes, answer. Yes, yes. Yeah, because
all of the yeses.
Yeah, brilliant. Because an apprentice is an employee by law, they have to be paid, and they have to be paid national minimum wage as a minimum. You can pay an apprentice more, and we'd always encourage that if you're able to do so. Now, there is an apprenticeship minimum wage that applies. This applies in all 4 nations of the UK, which is a slightly lower rate of pay. I think it's about maybe, Hannah, you can quickly Google it. I think it's about £3.70 an hour, which is really low. But apprenticeship minimum wage can be paid to any apprentice, regardless of their age, for the first year of their apprenticeship. We're not advocating that, but that is the legal minimum you can pay. It can also be paid for 16 to 18-year-olds who go into their second year of an apprenticeship, but that's it. If then someone who is aged 19 or over goes into a second year of their apprenticeship, they then must be paid the appropriate national minimum wage rate for their age. So obviously, if they're over 23, that would be the highest minimum wage rate that exists.
Yeah, I've just popped it in the chat, Sarah, and looking at current rates. 23 and over from April 21 is £8.91.
Right.
21 to 22, £8.36. 18 to 20, £6.56. Under 18, £4.62. An apprentice, £4.30.
Yeah. Oh, it's gone up, so that's good. Although £4.30 an hour is still not a lot to live on, but remember that £4.30 an hour only applies to someone in the first year of their apprenticeship, or if they're under 18, they're 18 or under. You can't continue to pay that. Do you need to treat an apprentice differently to other staff? Bung your answers in.
It's also worth saying, Sarah, isn't it, that we worked together a couple of years ago to create quite a pretty chart that shows the differences between a volunteer, an apprentice, a T-level, etc. So we can link to those, so you can really clearly see whether they're paid, whether they're not, the duration and things like that. So it's quite a useful visual guide.
Absolutely. And we also run a separate session. It's a much longer session. It's a 3-hour session, which we call a best practice guide to recruitment for creative leaders, which also talks about different work-based entry routes that can be used and how to use them lawfully.
So we have one person saying yes, supervision, training, feedback, etc.
So there's truth in that. That we would encourage all employers to recognise that an apprentice, regardless of their age or the occupation they're training for, is learning how to reach competence. They shouldn't be expected to undertake duties from the off without being given guidance to undertake them. But overall, an apprentice shouldn't be treated differently. They are part of your team. They are a dedicated member of staff. They are an employee to whom you issue a contract of employment. So the answer is absolutely right in that the employer should be mindful that the individual is learning, and as such, you may want to offer a little more supervision than you would to someone who is already working autonomously in their role. But outside of that, they shouldn't be treated any differently. And we have had some horror stories here where apprentices have been left out of team meetings, where we had one case of where an apprentice had their employment terminated because the employer thought they couldn't leave them in the office on their own. That's nonsense. That's not okay. So no, they are an employee, and remember, employment law protects all employees from the age of 16. Are they entitled to holiday? We get this question all the time.
Anyone? Holiday? Yes. Yes.
Of course they are, because they're an employee, right? We've just covered they shouldn't be treated differently to any other staff. They are entitled to exactly the same holiday allowance as your policy dictates, not statutory, which is 20, unless your policy is statutory holiday, which is 20 days a year. They are entitled to exactly the same holiday allowance as any other member of staff as per your policy. And again, we've had some horror stories here where they don't think that the apprentice is entitled to holiday. They haven't paid them for their holiday as an employee. They receive paid holiday in line with your policy. How many hours a week should they work?
Okay. Just looking at the chat. Good question. I actually don't know the answer, Sarah. We've got 4 hours. We've got 4. I don't think there's 4 days, and then we've got something that says depends on age. Working time regs apply ?
Absolutely do. Yeah.
Yeah. And the same as everyone else in the organisation ?
Yep. So there is a minimum requirement for apprenticeships, and this varies by nation. In England, apprentices should be contracted and paid for no less than 30 hours a week, and for no less, and I'm answering the next question actually, for 12 months. That is the minimum that an apprentice should be contracted for, 30 hours a week for 12 months. Now, an apprentice can, in England, undertake their apprenticeship part-time, but you then have to extend their paid contract of employment to be the equivalent of 30 hours a week for 12 months. So if you pay them and have them working for you for 15 hours a week, you must extend their minimum contract to 24 months. So it's the equivalent of 30 hours over 12 months. They get paid for the same duration. However, each apprenticeship standard has what's called a typical duration within it. And the steer to employers is that you should contract the apprentice for that typical duration at no less than 30 hours a week. And I should specify here that the apprentice is paid within those contractual hours to do the 20% off the job training as well. We've seen employers try not to pay that. You are paying the apprentices time for the 20% off the job as well. So if you're employing them for 5 days a week, say on a 37 and a half hour week, sorry, can't talk now, 37 and a half hours a week, 20% would typically be 1 day a week. If they did day release, you are paying them for the full 37 and a half hours, so including that day release. Now, for those who are on the call from either Scotland or Wales, I don't think I've got anyone from Northern Ireland. In Wales, the minimum hours a week that the apprentice should be contracted for is 16, and no less than 12 months. And in Scotland, there is no minimum. It is for the duration that is required to help that individual reach competence or achieve their apprenticeship. Do you have to employ the apprentice at the end of their apprenticeship? We get asked this all the time.
Okay, let's see what comes up in the chat. Got a no.
That's absolutely right. You're not obligated to employ the apprentice at the end, but there is a desire for employers to only really create apprenticeships if they have a genuine need for someone to learn how to do that job and work for the company. But you're not obligated to keep them on. But what we do discourage is employers sort of treating apprenticeships like an add-on project. They're not. An apprentice is part of your staff team and they must be treated as such. They're not an add-on. But it is no different really from having a fixed term member of the team. So you're not obligated to keep them on. But
so Sarah, we just have a question on that. Actually, it's quite relevant. Somebody said no, but do you have to carry out a dismissal?
No, you don't, because you're issuing a fixed term contract of employment for the typical duration that would apply for that apprenticeship. If that apprentice needs a bit longer to reach competence and you're able to continue employing them to help them reach competence, then you can extend that fixed term contract of employment. But there's no formal dismissal. And it's probably worth me also saying there are certain there is some case law actually around apprenticeships that has applied only to apprentices, where apprentices have been unreasonably dismissed from their apprenticeship, and that apprentice has actually then taken the employer to the tribunal and won and had to be paid for the entire duration of their original contract. But I should stress, because I don't want to frighten anyone, that if circumstances change for a company, just as you would any member of staff, if things like redundancies had to happen, that's just the nature of employment. But you're not dismissing the apprentice at the end of their fixed term contract. They're literally coming to the end of their contract and hopefully doing so once they've reached competence and been assessed and certificated as.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's lots of people who have had apprentices during COVID and, they've worked through that.
Absolutely.
What's appropriate.
And there were apprentices that were made redundant during COVID. There were some apprentices that were put on what's called a break in learning with the training provider and the employer. And there were apprentices that were, of course, put on furlough because they were members of staff. So there's but if anyone ever wants a separate chat about that, we'd be happy to pick it up.
There's one more question which I think is a really good question. So we've just answered the furlough one by accident. And somebody else says in theatre lots of roles are freelance particular. So there wouldn't be a permanent option, there wouldn't be an option to offer a permanent role afterwards. Now, Sarah, maybe this is where we talk about potential changes now, or it's up to you.
So if the question relates to could the apprentice, once they've been certificated as competent, could then pursue working freelance, absolutely. We've seen lots of cases of that, particularly in the technical theatre space actually. That's perfectly permissible. There are other ways that apprentices can be contracted or employed in roles that might typically be filled by freelancers or self-employed contractors is the official terminology. So what's being introduced shortly is something called the Flexi Job Scheme, which some of you may have seen reference to, and UK Theatre recently submitted a response to the recent Flexi Job Scheme consultation. The Flexi Job Scheme is the new name for apprenticeship training agencies. They act as employment agencies for apprentices where an individual employer or set of employers would be unable to issue a direct contract of employment to an apprentice. And in that instance, the Flexi Job Scheme would be the employer, and you, the theatres in this instance, might be the host, where you provide the on-the-job learning for a certain period of time that then doesn't need to meet the minimum employment duration that we've just talked about. And that is one way to get over that issue around how an apprentice could train in an occupation that is typically filled by a freelancer. I should also at this point just flag, we actually have a separate session on working with freelancers or the self-employed, because what we see quite a lot of is some misunderstanding in our sector about what validly constitutes self-employed contract scenarios and what actually constitutes what should instead be fixed term employment. I won't talk about that today, but should anyone want to come to one of those sessions completely free, then that one only takes an hour, then you'd be most welcome. But I hope that answers the specific question.
Great.
And then just one more question here. Do I need a DBS or in Scotland a disclosure check?
If anybody wants to put answers in the chat. And DBS, remind us, Sarah.
Sorry, that is for the disclosure and barring service. That's the check that is undertaken. It's support safeguarding.
Yes.
So if you're working with young people.
Okay, so we've got a yes so far, and we've got depends on role requirements. And a no, so let's go with those.
Okay, thank you. So you, the employer or the manager, you don't need a DBS check to employ an apprentice who might be young, who might be 16 to 24. That it is a myth, because the apprentice is your employee and they are protected by employment law from the age of 16. However, if your apprentice is working in a space with young people, so for example, if they're working in the learning and participation department and maybe working with school children, you may want them to be DBS checked. But it is an absolute myth that the employer needs to be DBS checked in order to recruit an apprentice. The training provider is responsible for safeguarding the apprentice as a learner, because that's what they are to them, but to you, they are an employee. Okay, so let's come on to levels of learning. These levels apply in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I'm going to do this really quickly, and the reason I'm sharing it is because we see employers sometimes get a bit hung up on the levels of difficulty. It's really important to stress that levels of difficulty to describe an apprenticeship or any training or qualification is not necessarily about seniority. It's the level of difficulty at which an occupation has been pitched in this instance against a dedicated level descriptor. So if I wanted to retrain to do say a front of house role, I would be training at an apprenticeship level of difficulty that may be lower than prior qualifications that I hold. That is absolutely right if that's what the job requires. It's got nothing to do with the prior seniority of an individual. So sometimes if you hear the terms intermediate, advanced, higher or degree apprenticeships, these are the levels of difficulty that they're describing. So an intermediate apprenticeship refers to a level 2 apprenticeship. Level 2 describes the equivalent level of difficulty. This is not about volume of learning, the amount of learning someone does. It's about the level of difficulty that the apprentice is working to reach by the end of their apprenticeship, not where they come in. So remember, we're ignoring any prerequisites for entry, any prior qualifications that someone might hold. So level 2 is the equivalent level of difficulty of GCSE grade A star to C or 4 to 9 in the new grading system. Okay, it's that level of difficulty. Advanced apprenticeships are level 3 apprenticeships. That's the equivalent level of difficulty, not volume or value, as A levels. Higher level apprenticeships describe the levels that read across to higher education study. Remember, this is not about value or volume. It's not directly comparable to academic study in its nature, but level of difficulty. Level 4, a higher level apprenticeship at level 4, the level of difficulty the apprentice is reaching by the end of their apprenticeship is the equivalent level of difficulty to the first full-time year of a bachelor's degree, or the first full-time year of a foundation degree, or the first full-time year of an HNC, a Higher National Certificate. Level 5, equivalent level of difficulty, not value or volume, level of difficulty to the second full-time year of a bachelor's degree. Level 6, third and final full-time year of a bachelor's degree. Level 7, postgraduate. So postgraduate certificates, postgraduate diplomas and master's degrees are all in the academic system at level 7. A higher level apprenticeship is at the same level of difficulty. It was helping someone work towards performing at the same level of difficulty by the end of their apprenticeship. So the solicitor apprenticeship I mentioned earlier, in fact, the production manager apprenticeship for theatre, they are level 7 apprenticeships. So they are deemed to be at postgraduate level of difficulty by the time someone reaches competence. Higher level apprenticeships do not include formal qualifications as standard. They just have 80% on the job, 20% off the job with a registered training provider, providing that underpinning knowledge. Degree apprenticeships do have a qualification because they include the achievement of a degree related to that the occupation the apprenticeship is written for, and they exist only at level 6 and level 7, and therefore include a full bachelor's degree if it's level 6, or a full master's degree if it's level 7. But if something is just a higher level apprenticeship, so a level 7 higher level apprenticeship, which is not a degree apprenticeship, doesn't include a master's degree. And I keep using the solicitor example, but the solicitor apprenticeship, in fact, the production manager apprenticeship at level 7, they do not include a degree. They do not include a master's degree. It's just the level of difficulty that occupation has been pitched at and the apprentice is working towards by the end of their apprenticeship. Now, for the employer we've got in Scotland, your rules are very different, I'm afraid. Scotland has its own levelling system. And I won't spell this out. It's got one more level than the England, Wales and Northern Ireland level descriptors, but I've given you the read across and I can share these slides afterwards. But you heard me make reference to the modern apprenticeship earlier for 16 to 24-year-olds. Modern apprenticeships sit at Scottish level 5, 6 and 7, which is the equivalent in England, Wales, Northern Ireland of level 2, level 3 and level 4. So GCSE, A-level first year of higher education. And then you can see in Scotland that they have a technical apprenticeship at our equivalent of level 5 and at level 6, but they also have graduate apprenticeships which have degrees in them. And they have in Scotland professional apprenticeships at Scottish level 12 are equivalent to level 8. You will see that I didn't mention level 8 in the level descriptors for England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and that's because apprenticeships don't exist at level 8 in those nations, but they do in Scotland. And for anyone who just wants to understand what level 8 is, the level of difficulty, it is the equivalent, not value or volume, but the equivalent level of difficulty to doctorate level. So someone who has a PhD has trained at the highest level of difficulty. They have a doctorate, that is level 8. So I just want to check if anyone's got any questions there. It's important that we don't get hung up on the levels though.
Yeah, no questions at the moment on that, but Sarah, I have added in the links to both of the guides you mentioned, so the self-employed best practice and also the levels guide, so that's in there for everyone. Great. But no questions.
Brilliant. So let's now tackle the apprenticeship levy. Is there anyone on the call that pays the apprenticeship levy? I know there is because I've seen who's on the call. But is there anyone on the call who knows they pay the apprenticeship levy?
Waiting for some answers. The bar, nothing coming through yet, but basically, okay. Yeah, nothing yet.
Okay, so the apprenticeship levy, which was introduced from May 2017, is paid by all UK employers that have a minimum pay bill of £3 million a year or more. The levy is a bit like a tax. Well, it's not a bit like a tax. It is a tax that is charged at 0.5% of your payroll costs above 3 million. So if your payroll, what goes through your PAYE, so if you pay, just to clarify, if you pay freelancers or self-employed contractors via invoice, that's not going through your PAYE. If your PAYE bill doesn't come to £3 million a year or more, then you're not paying the apprenticeship levy. But it is a tax of 0.5% on the proportion of your PAYE costs above the 3 million. So nothing is paid under 3 million. It is collected by HMRC via PAYE alongside your other taxes and national insurance contributions. And what the levy does is generate the pot of money that covers the off-the-job training costs, that 20% off the job that the training provider delivers. So your levy is generating the pot of money that pays training providers to deliver apprenticeship training off the job. It does not cover the cost of wages that you are obligated to pay in and above any levy contribution you make. This only applies in England, though. How the levy is paid by all UK employers that have a £3 million pay bill, but it is only the levy contribution only goes to pay training provider costs in England. In England, the monthly levy payment that employers make, have that payment turned back into digital vouchers to spend via your apprenticeship service account, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. The apprenticeship service account exists in England only, doesn't apply in the nations. And those employers that pay the levy can transfer up to 25% of the annual value of your levy vouchers to another employer each year to help them cover the costs of the off-the-job training costs for their apprentices. For those who don't pay the levy and don't have their levy payment transferred into training vouchers to spend on apprenticeship training, those employers have to make a contribution to the training costs of the training provider. It's called co-investment. The government covers 95% of the cost of the off-the-job training, and the non-levy paying employer has to pay 5% out of their pocket. Now, what determines that cost, the cost of the training, is what's called the funding band that's allocated to the apprenticeship. Funding bands are allocated to apprenticeship frameworks and to apprenticeship standards, but in England it is levy or co-investment that pays that funding band to the training provider and the endpoint assessment organisation. They take 20% of that funding band, the endpoint assessment organisation. That funding band can vary massively. It can vary from £1,500 right up to £27,000. So if you're a small employer that has to pay 5% of 27,000, that's quite a lot of money to find to pay for the to support the apprenticeship training element. And that's why employers that have spare levy vouchers that they're not expected to use should consider transferring them to other employers, ideally within the sector. That's what we advocate, to help those your partners and those in your supply chain also potentially cover the cost of the training for the apprenticeships, not the wages.
Sarah, I suppose from a bigger perspective, one of the things that you, us and others have been trying to kind of work with government on is that just again to hit home, the levy, a lot of it goes unspent, and it goes back to the Treasury after 2 years. So there's definitely an incentive for the sector to work together, if you've got unspent levy, to transfer that levy, and then it gets reinvested.
And absolutely. And from August, if you do transfer your levy, you'll be able to specify through your apprenticeship service account that you want your levy to be transferred specifically to your sector. And potentially you'll be able to specify the geography of where you want it to be invested. So you'll have more control over how your levy is transferred. I should also say that unspent levy, as Hannah has touched on, so from the moment your levy vouchers go into your apprenticeship service account, you have 2 years to use them. After those 2 years, it gets clawed back by government, as Hannah has said, and goes back into a central pot. But actually, what that clawback generates is the funding to cover non-levy paid apprenticeship training. So where I said for non-levy payers, they enter into a co-investment model to cover the cost of the apprenticeship training, the off-the-job training, that the government pays 95% of and the employer pays 5% of. That 95% that the government covers technically comes from your unspent levy clawback. Whether it is actually worked like that in reality, no one's really sure, but that's the idea.
And so I suppose that could go into any sector though, couldn't it?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You have no control then. Once it's clawed back, you have no say at all on where your unspent levy is going. It is going into apprenticeship provision, but you're not necessarily guaranteeing it going into a sector that you want to support, but levy transfer will guarantee that.
Yeah, so we would encourage you to do that, to technically keep it in our sector and pipeline.
Absolutely. And I should say these rules apply in England only, but even though the levy is paid by all UK employers with a pay bill of £3 million or more, in the nations, in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, the proportion of levy that is collected from organisations in the requisite nations, it just goes into the government pot. It is in different nations, is typically used to support, to fund skills provision, but it isn't as specific as it is in England. In England, it's only used to cover the cost of apprenticeship training. In the nations, it can be used more broadly. And I should also specify that for organisations that operate UK-wide and have staff that are based UK-wide, the levy calculation, I don't want to get too technical here, but the levy calculation is based on the proportion of your workers and where their postcodes are. So to give you an example, if you have if 75% of your workers have a postcode registered with HMRC that is in England, then the levy vouchers that you get back to spend on apprenticeship training in England will be 75% plus 10% top up from government to spend on apprenticeship training in England. The other 25% proportion gets allocated to the relevant nation depending on the percentage proportion of your staff and their postcodes in those nations. Did that make sense?
Yes. While we're on that really quickly, because I'm quite aware of time, there was a question that came in about if you employ an apprentice who lives in Scotland on a digital role, but the company HQ is in England, do they follow the UK apprentice or Scotland levels of difficulty in monitoring? And if there's no time to answer it now, we can come back to it.
So if If the do you mean if the apprentice is physically based in Scotland?
Yeah, they live in Scotland.
So some of that, it's not always a straightforward answer. It depends on where they're doing the work for. If they live in Scotland but they're doing the work for
They're doing the work
England,
for a company headquarters in England,
then they would typically undertake, I think, an apprenticeship in England. I'll double check that, but
okay, great.
Different nations have slightly different rules. So Wales, some take the view that if 51% of your apprenticeship is spent on activity, on work that applies to England, you register to do an England apprenticeship. Scotland may take a slightly different view there. But it's also in part linked to the training provider and where that individual would be registered with the training provider. If the training provider would be in Scotland, i.e. they wouldn't be learning remotely, they'd be doing day release or whatever, then they would be registered with the Scottish system and on an apprenticeship framework. But it varies depending on the job, on the nature and focus of that job, and how much time they'll be spending on work that applies to the specific nation. So it's not overly black and white.
Okay, so what we can always do is the question was from Kirsten. So Kirsten, if you follow up with us afterwards,
yeah,
then
we can support you. Yeah, we can have a chat with what you're looking at, and then we can help you navigate it. That's no problem.
Sorry for interrupting.
Okay, so and just to clarify, I'm going to do this really quickly because this bit is sort of ultra dry, but the apprenticeship service that I've been referencing, where levy payers in England, your levy payment gets turned into vouchers to spend on apprenticeship training, is where all apprenticeship things happen, basically. So you have your own apprenticeship service account, your one section of the apprenticeship service where your vouchers are and where you get to choose your training provider and spend your vouchers on apprenticeship training. But it's also where apprenticeship vacancies are advertised as a minimum, and where applications from potential apprentices are received and managed. The public facing name of this bit of the apprenticeship service is called Find an Apprenticeship. It's where you, as I've said, levy payers manage your levy vouchers, and where you can also transfer levy vouchers to others, as we've already spoken about. It's where you select what training you want your apprentice to receive and the training provider to deliver it. Only training providers registered to deliver the apprenticeship you've chosen will come up when you select the apprenticeship. And it's also where endpoint assessment organisations can add standards to their portfolio and record assessment outcomes for individual apprentices, which is what then triggers the Education and Skills Funding Agency to release the apprenticeship certificate. So here, we're almost there, folks. Here are some key facts about apprenticeship. So I hope I've given you just the basic nuts and bolts. As I said, we have a session which takes a much deeper dive that looks into how you can approach recruitment of your apprentices and how you can think about inducting them, how you work with the training provider, things to look out for when choosing a training provider, a sort of quality measure. And we also cover things about safeguarding, etc., and understanding the differences and the boundaries. But today, as I said, is just designed to give you the basic foundation and understanding about what an apprenticeship really is and the sort of nuts and bolts that need to be taken on board. But it's really important for us to bear in mind that apprenticeships work. We know they work. There's really good evidence to show that they train people for the jobs we need them to do, and progression rates, particularly in our sector, are really high. So if someone typically does an apprenticeship in our sector, they stay in paid employment. It might not be with the same employer, but they stay in paid employment. So we know they're great for preparing individuals for the world of work. 87% of apprentices, this isn't specific to our sector now, but these are just general stats. 87% of apprentices that completed their apprenticeship in the last 10 years are still working for the business they did that apprenticeship with. There is really good evidence to show that real loyalty is built between an apprentice and their employer when that apprentice trains with them, from both sides, and that's really nice. Apprenticeships generate on average £26 to £28 for the economy for every pound invested. That is a remarkable return on investment. And actually we've seen really good evidence, particularly in micros, where taking on apprentices have then helped free up founders or directors to concentrate on business development. And we've seen cases where productivity has increased so much in micros that those individuals have then been able to pay for themselves after their apprenticeship. It's generated so much more income that it's then just paid for them to stay on. And so we know we know it increases productivity. We've seen it firsthand. Higher apprentices, so those undertaking higher level apprenticeships, earn up to £150,000 more over their career than their academic counterparts. So there is lots of talk about if you, and I should say we're not anti-degree or anti-academic routes, but there is a bit of a myth that if you pursue academic training at a higher level, you're going to earn more. And actually, statistically, if you train at a higher level through a technical route, you'll earn more over the life of your career. And of course, you have technically no debt. You're paid for the entire duration of an apprenticeship. Obviously, if you study higher education academically, you pay to go. That doesn't happen with an apprentice. There's no debt at the end for the individual, and that's got to be a positive thing. But it has also been proven to be partly why apprenticeships are highly effective for those from certain socioeconomic groups who actually outperform their statistically their better off peers via an apprenticeship route. So from a social mobility point of view, we also know apprenticeships work. And 90% in our sector, 90% will typically of apprentices will typically progress into a further job or training after their apprenticeship. That progression rate is almost unheard of in most other parts of the education sector. So there is lots of research that shows apprenticeships work, but only if employers use them in the right way. And so it's important for us to remember that apprenticeships don't exist or shouldn't exist without a real job for someone to learn how to do. They are designed to help someone reach occupational competence and aren't therefore for those who already have competence in an occupation. It's important for me to stress, and this might sound like an odd thing for me to say, apprenticeships are not a social responsibility project. That is not to say we shouldn't encourage employers to act in a socially responsible way, but apprenticeships and apprentices aren't projects per se, but they are incredibly well placed, as I've already said, to support social mobility, not the same as social responsibility. We need employers to recruit openly and fairly and recruit for potential in order for apprenticeships to work as intended. They are part of the technical education system, and the technical education system is designed fundamentally to train people for work. That's what this part of the system does. They are either helping them get ready for work or train them specifically for an occupation in the world of work, unlike academic study that actually isn't purposed towards training people for the world of work as such. Systemically, that's not what the system was designed to do. There are exceptions that apply. Obviously, you're training to be a vet or a doctor, etc., you would do so via an academic route. So it does leave us asking why we have such a propensity to recruit people who have followed an academic training route, that are graduates, when we know we've got skills issues in the sector, and we know that apprenticeships and other work-based entry routes are a really sound way to help us address those skills issues, whilst also serving as a brilliant social mobility tool. And that's it, folks. You've made it to the end. Well done. As I said earlier, we do have a range of other sessions that are available to anyone in the sector should they wish to take part. We have one called A Manager's Guide to Apprenticeships. That's the deeper dive that I've already touched on. I also referenced our best practice recruitment guide for creative leaders, guidance on internships and volunteering. And this guidance is designed to help organisations understand what constitutes valid volunteering and when conditions tip into unpaid work, which puts your business at risk. Working with freelancers or self-employed contractors, as I've said, is the formal term. And we also offer one-to-one support and guidance. We are here for employers to use as much or as little as they want. There is no charge at all for working with us. So that just leaves me to say thank you very much for having me. And are there any final questions?
So, well, it leaves us to say thank you, Sarah. First of all, I mean, I know a little bit about apprenticeships, but I found today massively useful, again, to sort of debunk those myths and things. I had just one final question, really, which, well, it was two things. From today, if people are going to go away and they're like, I think I want an apprentice, what are the 3 things they need to do, or what are their next steps after today?
So if you're thinking about creating an apprenticeship opportunity, what we would encourage you to do is think about the job, the role that you want to train individuals for. And so what we urge employers to do first and foremost is to write the real job description for the real job that you may want to create an apprenticeship for. So start there. Then you need to use that job description to match it to the most appropriate apprenticeship standard or framework. We can help you do that. And then once you're clear about the apprenticeship, the underpinning apprenticeship framework or standard, you can then start to identify the training provider who can support you, and then go out to open recruitment. We can help you with every step of that journey if you want us to, or we can, even if you just want a quick phone call to say, what shall I do now? Who can I reach out to now? That's fine. But we always say, if you're going to start to create apprenticeships, always start with the real job and identifying the real job and its associated job description that you want to train someone for.
Amazing, thank you. And I suppose that people can either get in contact via us or via Sarah or via the CC. Like I said, there's a lot of information on the CC Skills website as well. So again, we will share the PDF of the slides. We will recap any links to anything that we talked about in the chat. So I think that'll be really, really helpful. And then finally, I suppose the other thing is, in the current climate, we are fully aware of the fact that a lot of the sector is still not opened yet. So we're not presenting this without understanding that wider context. But I suppose one of the reasons why we're doing it now is, as we start to reopen and as we start to rebuild the sector, I think some of the things we can think about in terms of bringing talent into the sector from, in terms of diversity, inclusion, apprenticeships can be one of the ways that we can do that as well. So I think the timing of this is quite nice, isn't it, Sarah, really?
Absolutely. But it's also maybe worth me saying the best practice recruitment guide session that we do is entirely about that. It's about how we can use different routes into the sector, including apprenticeships, but it goes beyond apprenticeships, to help us proactively open our doors more widely to the most diverse pool of talent, and how we can think about using different routes a bit differently, actually, and more inclusively. So if anyone wants to go through that session, they are free to do so and welcome to do so.
All right, so I haven't had any other questions in for now, but we should say, if you do have questions following this, just contact, we've got contact UK Theatre Salt, or contact me directly, or Annie. So we're just our first names, so Hannah at Salt UKT, or Annie at same as, and we will come back to you or put you in contact with Sarah. But we are bang on 11:30, so thank you so much, Sarah. That is invaluable,
thanks for having me.
Always. All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks for joining, everyone. Bye for now.